Millstone Farm was nestled in a valley surrounded by gentle grass-covered hills. In the autumn, fog stretched out like a white sheet, hiding part of the landscape. Early in the morning, one could usually hear only the soft whisper of the wind. But on that particular dawn, the silence felt heavier, almost like a sign that something big was about to happen. James Miller, a man of average stature with slightly graying hair at the temples and calloused hands, woke up even before the rooster crowed. He had slept little, feeling as though the night had passed far too quickly. When he opened his eyes, still with heavy eyelids, he felt a chill run down his spine. It wasn't just the low temperature in the room, it was the intuition that something in the air was different. He got up slowly, trying not to make any noise so as not to wake Emily, his wife. She slept on her side, her hands intertwined over her belly, as if trying to protect something. Emily had made that gesture every night since their last loss, about 5 years earlier. The small wooden bed creaked when James moved to place his feet on the floor. Feeling the cold floorboards brought him back to reality. It was time to tend to the farm chores after all. James went downstairs, each step eliciting a creak that echoed through the empty rooms. The house had few pieces of furniture, but each carried its own history. The pictures on the walls showed older generations of his family working the land. In the kitchen, he lit the wood-burning stove and put water to boil in the kettle, watching the flickering yellow flame. While waiting for the water to heat, he moved closer to the window overlooking the fields. He noticed that the fog was still dense, framing everything outside in a grayish hue. The fog was so thick that James couldn't see very far, but he knew that beyond it, there were the hills that protected the property. Those hills were like slumbering giants, both beautiful and imposing. The autumn weather left the tree leaves in shades ranging from yellow to brown, and many ended up on the ground, forming a carpet that spread along the path to the corral. After drinking a simple tea to ward off the cold, James put on his worn-out coat and slipped on his already battered boots. He checked the machete he always carried at his waist, a useful tool for clearing brush and protecting himself from the region's possible though rare dangers. When he opened the wooden door, a gust of cold air hit his face, making him instinctively shrug his shoulders. Outside, daylight was slowly breaking, and an orange glow started to slice through the fog. He headed toward the corral, noticing the ground was a bit muddy, probably from the light rain the night before. As he crossed the yard, a few chickens pecked around his feet, picking at small grains on the damp ground. The smell of wet earth was intense, almost clinging to his nostrils. Amid the sound of chickens and the gentle breeze, James heard a cow's moo in the distance, drawing his attention back to the corral. It was Daisy, the oldest cow they had. She had been with them for many years and was practically part of the family, thanks to her calm and docile temperament. However, at that moment, her moo sounded different. It seemed more desperate, like a call for someone to come to her. James quickened his pace. Upon reaching the corral fence, he spotted Daisy standing by herself, while the other cows stayed in another corner, huddled together. The way Daisy moved her head and stamped her hooves on the ground showed agitation, something he wasn't used to seeing in her behavior. Usually, Daisy was the calmest in the herd. "Everything all right, girl?" James asked in a low voice, approaching carefully. He was used to speaking softly to the animals, believing it helped keep them calmer. Daisy kept turning her head toward a spot beyond the fence, where weeds grew and some dry branches were scattered near the entrance to a small wooded area. It was as if she wanted to lead James there. He felt an inexplicable shiver upon noticing her insistence. It was unlike a cow who would normally be concerned only with feeding and resting. "What are you trying to tell me?" he murmured, scratching his sparse beard. At that moment, he sensed a strange smell in the air, a mix of wet earth with something sweet, yet carrying a hint of decay. It was not a common odor on the farm, and it left him even more uneasy. Emily, who had gotten up moments after noticing her husband was no longer in bed, appeared in the barn doorway. She wore a shawl over her shoulders and watched Daisy with a worried look. The morning light revealed the fatigue on her face, likely from a restless night. "She's been like that since I woke up," Emily said, taking a small step forward. "It looks like she wants to get our attention about something important." James frowned. He didn't really believe in premonitions or anything beyond the ordinary farm work, but that strange feeling in the air wouldn't go away. He decided to follow Daisy to wherever she was pointing. He climbed over the fence, feeling the mud cling to his boots, and began walking in the direction the cow indicated. Daisy followed a few steps behind, as if wanting to make sure James wouldn't give up before reaching the right spot. The wind blew stronger, and the smell of wet earth mixed with that sweet, rotting odor became more intense, causing James to wrinkle his nose. Emily stayed at the entrance to the corral, watching her husband disappear into the taller vegetation. As soon as he reached the spot, James noticed a tangle of weeds, dry branches, and fallen leaves. It seemed like an abandoned corner, untouched for a long time. The smell was strongest there, and Daisy let out a moo that sounded like a lament, almost a plea for help. James felt his heart tighten, as he had never seen such a reaction in an animal that had always been so docile. He gripped the handle of his machete, feeling a slight tremor in his fingers. He wasn't afraid of a wild animal, but rather of the unknown. What might he find there? With a firm swing, he began cutting away the branches blocking the view of what lay in that corner. With each branch he chopped, the morning light revealed more of what looked like a cardboard box, half buried in the damp earth. The sides of the box were torn, as if they'd been scratched or dragged by something. James took a deep breath, trying to ignore the increasingly powerful stench. Once the box was more visible, he pulled it from the tangle of dry leaves and saw that its bottom was wet and dirty. Then, carefully, he removed the last layers of leaves and branches covering the inside of the box. What he saw made his heart race and his hands tremble. Inside was a baby, a very small baby, practically naked, with skin so pale it seemed to reflect the faint light coming in. A few ants crawled over the baby's body, and the child's lips were purplish like overripe fruit. For a moment, James believed that the child was dead, as the body seemed motionless, without any reaction. But when he touched the tiny arm, he felt the small fingers twitch. Then came a weak, almost inaudible whimper, enough to confirm there was life. James's chest tightened fiercely, as though something were crushing him inside. He removed the machete from his belt and tossed it to the ground, not caring where the blade landed. "My God," was all he could say, his voice caught in his throat. Without hesitation, he bent down and took off the wool jacket he wore, carefully wrapping the baby in it. The child's body was ice cold and its breathing was very faint. James could feel his own heart pounding as he tried to share some warmth with the baby he now held in his arms. Daisy at his side mooed once more, though this time it sounded like relief, as if she had completed a mission by leading James to that place. He couldn't understand how any of this had happened. Who would have left a newborn in a cardboard box, there in the middle of the weeds? There was no sign of anyone else around, no obvious clues. Fear mixed with the urgency to save that fragile life. With his heart racing, James returned to the house, holding the child close to his chest to protect it from the cold wind. The mud on the path made each step difficult, and although the baby didn't weigh much, the tension of the moment made every movement feel more taxing. Emily, who had been watching from a distance, saw her husband returning with his jacket in his arms. Even without knowing what it was, she felt her stomach turn with apprehension. When James reached the porch, Emily got a clearer look at what he was carrying. Realizing it was a baby, her face went pale. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she hurried to make room for James to enter the kitchen. She asked no questions, only ran to fetch clean cloths and warm water. "Put him here," she said, her voice trembling, pointing to the wooden table. "Let's warm him up." James obeyed, laying the tiny body on the smooth surface. The baby still had his eyes closed, letting out faint whimpers of pain or cold. Emily brought the warmed cloths and began to clean him gently, removing the ants and grime stuck to his skin. The baby's chest rose and fell weakly, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough to show he was still fighting for life. While Emily tended to the baby, James's mind filled with painful memories. How many times had they dreamed of holding a child in their arms, only to fail? He remembered the long nights finding his wife kneeling, praying for a miracle that never came. Now, here in front of them was a baby, rescued from who knows what circumstances. It felt like fate had placed a life in their hands in a harsh, unexpected way, but also filled with hope. As the kitchen filled with the moist steam from the warm cloths, Daisy remained outside mooing intermittently. She seemed unwilling to go far away, as if protecting not only the herd, but also that new little being. James felt immense gratitude for the cow, knowing that if not for her insistence, the baby might not have been found in time. Emily moved closer to the wood stove, where a pot of water was almost boiling. She put in more cloths to warm, rubbing her hands nervously on her apron. The two exchanged glances but spoke little. It was as though words weren't enough to describe the avalanche of emotions they were experiencing. "We need to heat up some milk," she finally said, wiping away the tears that continued to fall. "If he can drink even a little, maybe he'll get stronger." James nodded. He went to milk one of the younger cows, because the goat's milk they usually kept was reserved for cheese-making. Right then, any fresh milk could help. He recalled that Daisy was already in the late stage of lactation, but he didn't want to overburden her further. He grabbed a bucket, crossed the yard to the stable, and did the job quickly yet carefully. His mind was racing, but the almost automatic act of milking brought a bit of relief, as it was something he had done for so many years he could have done it with his eyes closed. Still, the tension refused to leave his chest. When he returned to the kitchen, he found Emily holding the baby in her arms. She had warmed some milk and was trying to get the infant to take it, using a piece of clean cloth wrapped around her finger. The child whimpered quietly, still very weak, but moved his tiny mouth slightly, a sign of life. "He needs a doctor, James," Emily said, her eyes never leaving the baby's pale face. "We can't take any chances." "I know. I'll go to town and call Dr. Ernest. He's the only doctor who might come this early," James replied, glancing out the window, as though already mentally calculating how long it would take to reach the nearest town. It was about a 20-minute drive, but they only had an old pickup truck that had been acting up lately. Regardless, they had no choice. James kissed Emily on the forehead, where she still held the baby gently, and left the house in swift steps. Climbing into the pickup, he started the engine, feeling it sputter a few times before it finally caught. Then he headed down the dirt road that connected the farm to the rest of the world. The road was slippery from the previous night's rain, and the truck bounced over every pothole. James tried to maintain speed but had to be careful not to skid. His thoughts revolved around the baby and Emily, who stayed behind to care for him until the doctor arrived. As he drove, memories flooded his mind. He recalled the day he and Emily got married, filled with plans and dreams for the future. He remembered the first harvests and the joy of working side by side in the fields. Then came the attempts to have children, the first positive pregnancy tests that ended in heartbreak. They had even considered adoption, but the bureaucracy and fear of more suffering had made them pause. Over the years, they always clung to the hope of growing their family naturally, but it never happened. And now, out of nowhere, a baby was dropped into their lives, abandoned like a stray seed cast onto the ground. He shook his head to push away those thoughts and focused on the road. Occasionally he passed small homesteads, but the sun was still rising, and most folks were likely inside, warming themselves before starting their daily work. After nearly 20 minutes, he saw the wooden sign indicating the entrance to the town. It wasn't exactly a big city, but it had a few shops, a church, a small police station, and the medical office of Dr. Ernest Carter, a man of few words but known for his skill. James parked in front of the clinic, a simple white and blue wooden building. He got out and knocked vigorously on the door, knowing it might be locked since it was still early. He heard slow footsteps and soon the door opened, revealing Dr. Carter, his hair white, glasses with round frames. Even without speaking, the doctor noticed James's alarmed expression. "Doctor, I need you to come to my farm right now," James said, still catching his breath. "We found a baby abandoned in the brush. He's alive, but very weak." Dr. Ernest grabbed his hat and a leather doctor's bag he kept ready for emergencies. He looked at James with a serious yet understanding expression. "Let's go, get in the truck," he replied. "Tell me the details while we drive." They climbed into the pickup truck. James turned it around and sped back toward Millstone Farm. Along the way, he explained to the doctor everything that had happened that morning. Daisy's strange behavior, the cardboard box, the foul smell, and how he found the baby nearly lifeless. He also mentioned Emily's anxiety, as she had lost children before and now was confronted by this wholly unexpected situation. "He was so cold, Doctor," James said, wiping the sweat from his brow. "I think if we'd taken any longer, he wouldn't have made it. He barely moved. We managed to warm him up, but I don't know if that will be enough." Dr. Carter listened attentively. By the time they reached the farm's entrance, the sun had risen higher in the sky, dispersing most of the fog. Still, there was a lingering chill in the air, and something about it felt off to the doctor, though he couldn't quite say why. He grabbed his bag and jumped out of the truck as soon as they parked. Emily was waiting on the porch, holding the baby wrapped in a blanket. "Doctor." Carter climbed the steps, greeted her briefly, and instructed her to come inside at once so he could examine the child away from the wind. In the kitchen, he set his bag on the wooden table, which still bore a damp mark from where the baby had previously lain. He touched the baby's forehead, observed his breathing, and used a stethoscope to listen to the tiny heart. Concern was evident in his expression, though there was a bit of relief upon hearing a steady, albeit faint, heartbeat. "He has hypothermia and dehydration," he said, looking at Emily and James. "We need to keep him warm and give him some fluids, but from what I can tell, there's a chance he'll survive." Emily exhaled, closing her eyes for a moment, as if offering a silent prayer of thanks. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders, but the tension remained palpable. He noticed Daisy still outside, letting out soft moos, as if she was still uneasy. "Doctor." Carter stayed a while to make sure the baby was in a safe, comfortable position, with no risk of choking. He gave instructions on how to feed him small amounts of milk at regular intervals, and said he'd return later to check up on him. After offering more guidance, the doctor said goodbye with a handshake, reminding the couple to alert him of any changes. "See if you can find out anything in the area. Someone might have seen or heard something," the doctor suggested, referring to the possibility of finding who had abandoned the child. James agreed, but before he could start looking for clues, he heard Daisy moo again, this time more insistently. She seemed to have stayed near the corral, staring at the same spot where the baby had been found. It troubled him. Emily, noticing her husband's gaze, came over and took his hand. "What is it?" she asked, her voice still trembling with emotion. "Are you going back there?" "I think I have to. Daisy doesn't normally act like this for no reason. You know how she is. Something tells me there's more out there." Emily felt a chill in her stomach. A terrible thought crossed her mind, though she didn't speak it aloud. She simply nodded, asking him to be cautious. "Doctor." Carter looked at them for a moment, as if he wanted to say something, but chose to remain silent and left, leaving the couple in the kitchen doorway. James took up the machete once more and went to where Daisy was pointing. The anxiety in him grew. The air seemed to grow heavier as he neared the same tangle of branches and weeds where he had found the first box. The sweet, rotten smell returned, as if more potent this time. Daisy stayed behind, but did not stop her soft moaning. James knelt on the muddy ground and started cutting away more branches. His heart thumped loudly. Part of him feared finding another abandoned child. Another part refused to imagine that possibility. Sweat trickled down his forehead despite the autumn chill. He strained his eyes and noticed something that looked like another box, half hidden among the leaves. He inched closer, swallowing hard. With the machete, he slashed the weeds, covering the object. Then he pulled the box free, noting it was dirtier and more damp, though still relatively intact. He steeled himself to open it, but the smell emanating was much worse than the first, an odor of death, strong and disturbing, making his stomach lurch. When he finally managed to see what was inside, he felt his legs wobble. A second baby, unmoving. Unlike the first, this one did not stir or make a sound, its skin ashen. It appeared to have been dead for some time, showing no sign of life. James let out a low groan, overcome with a sadness he couldn't put into words. It was too awful, and he wasn't prepared for a scene like that. Fighting nausea, he backed away, trying to collect his thoughts. There was nothing more to be done for this baby, who was now just a tiny, lifeless body. Ants and insects were beginning to crawl through the box. James could only kneel there, tears streaming uncontrollably down his face. The memory of each child he and Emily had lost hit him with full force. This was not just a miscarriage or a medical complication. It was someone who had deliberately left these helpless infants here, on the brink of death or already gone. Slowly he got to his feet and looked around. There were no clear footprints, no trace of who might have done this. It was as if whoever committed this cruel act had disappeared into the night. Daisy remained a few yards away, watching him with large, sad eyes. James knew she felt the same sorrow he did upon discovering that scene. Uncertain what else to do, he decided to bury the small body in a place he considered sacred on the farm, beneath the oldest apple tree, near a creek. Decades ago, James's grandfather had asked that his ashes be scattered there after his death. It was also the spot where James often found peace, sitting to reflect on life on spring afternoons. Wielding the machete, he dug into the damp soil, creating a hole deep enough to lay the tiny body to rest. Carefully, he removed the child from the box and placed him in the cool ground. He didn't know how to pray well, but he remembered a psalm from his childhood and recited the fragments he recalled, voice trembling. Tears dropped onto the soil, and the lump in his throat almost silenced him. He took 2 sticks and fashioned a small cross, staking it there as a mark of respect. He then stayed a few more minutes in silence, staring at the small mound of freshly turned earth. He felt powerless, mixed with anger that he could do nothing for that little angel who hadn't had a chance to live. At last, he wiped his tears with his coat sleeve, drew in a deep breath and headed back to the house, feeling his soul weighed down. By the time James returned, it was almost midday, but he felt as though he'd been on watch for days. Emily saw on his face that something terrible had happened, but didn't ask questions. She noted the soil on his hands and the sorrow etched into his features. She understood, without words, that there had been another discovery. In one corner of the kitchen, the baby they had saved lay sleeping in a basket cushioned with warm cloths. A small lamp glowed beside him, though it was midday, as Emily wanted to keep the area warm. When she heard James's footsteps, she looked up at him, and he approached the child. He saw that the baby's color was a bit better, no longer purplish. His breathing, while still delicate, was steadier. Dr. Carter had returned earlier that day to check on him. He left a bottle of medicine and recommended continued rest, as well as frequent feeding. He said the child's chances of survival were good, provided there was no serious infection. Emily followed the instructions to the letter, feeding the baby warm milk every 2 hours. Each slight improvement he showed filled her with hope. Nightfall brought even colder temperatures. The wind whistled through the window cracks, blending with the usual noises of the countryside, and a lingering sense of unease in the air. James and Emily prepared for a sleepless night, taking turns tending to the baby. The memory of the second infant lingered in James's mind, his chest tightening whenever he thought of it. Still, he decided not to tell Emily every detail. She had already suffered so much, and he wanted to spare her, though he knew she would learn the truth eventually. They pulled a couple of chairs close to the stove, where a pot of water kept the air from getting too dry. They placed the basket with the baby near them, close to the heat. Around 11 o'clock at night, Emily, who was changing the baby's cloths, noticed something that made her smile. The baby opened his eyes for a second. They were such bright, clear blue eyes that it nearly startled her. "James," she called softly, as if not wanting to alarm the little one. He opened his eyes. James, who had been dozing with his head against the wall, woke up suddenly and moved closer. He saw those bright eyes. He couldn't be sure if the baby could see him, but at that moment he felt a profound connection, as though that gaze was a sign the boy wanted to stay and fight for life at their side. "He's strong, Emily," James said, his voice quavering. "We'll do everything we can." Emily began to cry silently, without sobs, letting tears roll down her cheeks. She brushed her hand over the baby's soft hair, her heart brimming with hope and fear at the same time. It was as if every good feeling arrived with a pang of apprehension, given all they had been through. The next hours were among the longest the couple had ever experienced. From time to time, one of them dozed off for a few minutes, while the other watched the baby's breathing and kept the cloths warm. The entire farm seemed wrapped in a blanket of silence, broken only by the wind and the occasional moo from Daisy. Outside, the dark sky contrasted with the small stove flame lighting up the kitchen. Emily brewed some herbal tea for herself and James, trying to stay warm and alert. With each sip, she remembered the agony of losing her own children before they could be born. The pain, the blood, the days she spent bedridden, and how James had stood by her through it all. Now, however, it was different. They had a tiny being who needed their constant care. They had to fight for him. Around 3 in the morning, the baby started to cough. Emily panicked, fearing it could be pneumonia or something else. But soon he settled, breathing deeply again before drifting back to sleep. James pressed his ear to the baby's chest, trying to hear a heartbeat, and felt a faint but steady rhythm. What a relief. Periodically, they trickled milk into his little mouth, preventing dehydration. The night crept by. Sleep weighed heavy on their eyelids, but the fear of something going wrong kept them both on edge. Emily decided to sing an old lullaby her mother had taught her as a child. The gentle melody and simple words spoke of love and protection. James realized he hadn't heard his wife sing like that in a long time. Her voice was thick with emotion, yet still sweet. The baby stirred slightly, as though he could feel the affection in that lullaby. "We need to give him a name," Emily said quietly, without stopping her gentle touch on the blanket. "We can't just keep calling him the baby." James nodded, taking a deep breath before suggesting, "How about Michael?" She smiled, running her hand along the baby's face. It sounded like a strong name for someone fighting so hard to survive, and so it was decided. The little one would be called Michael. In a way, the simple act of choosing a name filled them with new hope. It was as though by naming him, the couple fully accepted the responsibility to care for and love that child. When the sun finally started to rise, James felt his eyelids droop. He had dozed off against the wooden chair. Emily, too, had drifted off for a few minutes, holding Michael's tiny hand. Despite the exhaustion, they both saw that the baby was still breathing. A good sign. James's heart overflowed with gratitude as he watched the small chest rise and fall, fragile but steady. He opened the door to let in some fresh air despite the cold. The daylight illuminated the kitchen, revealing the mess of cloths, empty cups, and their tired faces. Yet it was a scene of hope. With each new ray of sunlight, Michael seemed to gain another chance to live. Before doing anything else, James decided to go back to the apple tree to place a small bouquet of wildflowers in memory of the second baby who hadn't survived. He gathered a few yellow flowers by the creek and walked quietly to the spot where he had dug the tiny grave. He laid the flowers on the fresh earth and stood there for a few moments in silence, recalling how he felt when he opened that second box. An overwhelming sense of horror and helplessness. At least they had managed to save one of them. While James performed that solitary tribute, Emily remained in the kitchen, caring for Michael. The baby slept soundly. She took the opportunity to tidy up the clutter and change the pot of water on the stove, keeping the area warm. She replaced the blanket lining so everything would be clean and comfortable. She looked at the little one's face, feeling an enormous affection and a powerful love, despite all that had happened. It was as though something inside her said this boy already belonged to their home, in an inexplicable way. In the following days, James and Emily had to adjust to a new routine. Caring for Michael required constant attention, as he was still weak and needed feeding every few hours. Emily improvised clothes for him, using some baby items stored away for years, dating back to her first pregnancy attempts. She washed everything carefully. There was a musty smell, but she was grateful she had kept it. Deep down, it was as if she had never truly given up on the dream of becoming a mother. Dr. Carter visited often to check on Michael's progress, bringing small doses of medicine and repeatedly stressing the importance of keeping the boy warm and well fed. The doctor rarely mentioned the legal complications of someone else claiming custody, but James and Emily knew the situation was complicated. In their rural community, though, things were more informal. What mattered most was keeping the baby alive and providing him a home. Meanwhile, James tried to find any clues about who had abandoned the children. He spoke to neighbors and even went to the local church to ask if anyone had seen a pregnant woman appear and then vanish. But the answers were always vague or negative. No one had useful information. Some seemed shocked or horrified, but no one knew anything tangible. He also went to the little town's police station to file a report. The sheriff, a burly man with a thick mustache named Norman, listened and took notes. He asked a few questions about the surviving baby's condition, but seemed to have limited resources for a deeper investigation. The area had few officers, and their priority was handling minor thefts or bar fights, not complex child abandonment cases. Still, Norman promised to do what he could, though he made no assurances. Life on the farm kept its usual pace, but James and Emily's focus revolved around Michael. He gradually gained weight, his eyes growing ever more alert to his surroundings. He slept most of the time, but when he was awake, he cried with a sound that quickened Emily's heartbeat. She never complained. She learned to understand each type of cry, an experience she had never had the chance to acquire before. James split his time between farm work and household chores so that Emily wouldn't be overwhelmed. He milked the cows, tended the crops, and inspected the fences. He also spent hours clearing out the area where he had found the boxes, as if he wanted to erase the sad memory. Yet he couldn't forget the second infant buried beneath the apple tree. Each time he passed by, he left a small flower or a sprig of leaves, a sign of respect. For Emily, each day with Michael felt like a victory, but also a constant reminder of the children she had lost. Sometimes, as she put him to sleep, she would touch the scars on her belly from surgeries and complications in her unsuccessful pregnancies. She would trace a finger over the uneven surface of her skin, pondering the mysteries of life. They had prayed so many times for a child, to no avail, and now fate had placed this baby in their arms, as unexpected as it was miraculous. She felt enormous love, but also an enormous fear of losing him. She sometimes had nightmares where she woke to find the cradle empty. In those moments, she would gently scoop Michael up, watching his breathing until certain he was all right. Physical exhaustion weighed on her, but nothing stopped her from doing what she felt needed to be done. James lived in a similar mix of happiness and anxiety. While working the fields, he imagined the future. Might Michael one day run through the corn rows, play with the chickens, or help harvest vegetables? He found himself smiling at the thought, yet also reminded himself to be cautious. The world could be cruel, and he didn't want anything bad to happen to the child he now loved as much as if they shared blood. As for Daisy, she returned to her usual calm state, seemingly more at ease than before. James suspected that she sensed the worst was over, as if her job, alerting them, was done. The bond between James, Emily, and Daisy grew even stronger, for they all knew Daisy had saved Michael's life. Weeks became months. Michael gained weight, learned to crawl, and eventually took his first wobbly steps inside the house. Dr. Carter still visited occasionally to assess Michael's development. Emily and James decided that if no one ever came forward to claim the child, they would consider him a permanent part of the family. Deep down, they already did. In a small rural community, legal processes were slow and informal. The main thing was ensuring the baby survived and had a home. Over time, everyone in the area treated Michael as James and Emily's son, despite the lack of blood ties. With time, the small cross James had placed under the apple tree became covered in ivy and leaves. The trunk of the old thick tree stood near the creek in a serene spot, where only the sound of running water and the distant singing of birds could be heard. James often went there with Michael to fish, though they rarely caught more than a few small fish. One autumn afternoon, while leaves drifted to the ground, Michael, by then 5 years old, was walking along the creek. He loved to pick up pebbles and skip them across the water's surface. Suddenly, he noticed the half-hidden cross. With a child's curiosity, he asked his father what it was. James hesitated, his heart tightening. He decided to be honest in a way the boy could grasp, explaining that it was the place where he had buried something very precious that could not live. Michael remained silent for a moment, gazing at the makeshift cross. Then he took his father's hand and looked up, his clear eyes filled with innocence. "Is it sad, Papa?" he asked softly. James swallowed hard. "Yes, son, it's sad. But sometimes we can't control what happens. All we can do is respect and honor the memory." Michael said nothing more, just nodded. He then knelt and placed a few dried flowers he found around them at the foot of the cross, trying to arrange them over the mossy area. James felt a surge of emotion at seeing this simple act. Even without knowing the full story, Michael understood the importance of that place. When Michael turned 10, James and Emily felt the time had come to share more details with him. He had begun to notice he didn't resemble them physically, and occasionally he heard whispers from neighbors about how lucky he was to have been found. One quiet night by the fireplace, the three of them together, they told him the truth. Emily began, explaining that when he was a newborn he had arrived in their lives in a very special way. She recounted how they found him in a box, out in the field, led there by Daisy's odd behavior. She described how James had rescued him and brought him home. It was a simple story, but heavy with emotion. She also admitted that they had always hoped for a child, though it never came, and that Michael's arrival felt like a gift from fate. Michael listened intently. He didn't cry. He merely asked if his real parents might return for him one day. James put a hand on the boy's shoulder, explaining that nobody had ever come or given any sign, and that he was part of their family from the very first moment. Emily confirmed it, assuring him that if he ever wished to seek out his roots, they would support him in that. He thought for a few seconds, then embraced both of them. Without words, he conveyed that he was all right with this. Yes, it was a sad story, but it was also filled with love. He felt cherished and safe, and nothing would change that. That night marked Michael's understanding of his origins and strengthened his bond with James and Emily even more. Life went on, but day-to-day existence wasn't always easy. The farm faced dry spells that damaged crops and reduced milk production. James and Emily worked tirelessly to meet their expenses. They had old debts and loans for equipment, and sometimes it was tough to keep the bills paid. Still, they persevered, believing in the land's value and the power of honest labor. Michael, now a teenager, helped as much as possible. He was bright, energetic, and eager to learn. Lack of resources meant his parents couldn't offer advanced education in a big city. The local school covered the basics, but anything beyond that would require time and money they didn't have to spare. Despite these limitations, Michael showed a knack for fixing tools and machinery. He loved taking things apart to see how they worked. One day, he repaired the old pickup's engine, surprising even his father. Perhaps this was his calling, James thought. Eventually, Daisy, by now very old, fell ill. The local vet came but said there was little to be done. It was simply old age taking its toll. The cow who had saved Michael's life grew frail and had trouble standing. Emily and James did everything they could to keep her comfortable. Blankets, gentle massages, but they knew her time was short. Michael spent a lot of time stroking Daisy's fur, recalling the stories his parents told about the day she alerted them to his presence. He felt a profound connection with her, as if she were a guardian angel. Although she was just a cow, Daisy had played a crucial role in his life. One night, Daisy quietly passed away, lying in the barn with Emily and Michael gently wiping her head with a damp cloth. James, who had gone to fetch the vet, arrived too late. He found his wife and son hugging each other, crying beside Daisy's lifeless body. It was a moment of deep sadness for the whole family. They decided to bury Daisy near the apple tree, not precisely where the second baby was laid to rest, but close enough that they felt both spirits would be at peace. 14-year-old Michael helped dig the grave and made a small wooden plaque with Daisy carved on it. After Daisy was gone, the farm seemed quieter. Michael was on the threshold of adulthood, and James and Emily realized he might soon have ambitions beyond the farm. Sitting together on the porch one evening, Emily told James, "Our boy is growing up, James. Soon he might want to leave for the city in search of work or studies." "I know," James replied, gazing at the horizon. "But let's see what destiny brings. I can't deny I worry, but I also want the best for him." Indeed, Michael dreamed of learning more about mechanics or electronics. He wanted to take a course that would teach him to repair agricultural machinery, perhaps even open his own small shop. He discussed it with his parents, who supported him, though they knew it meant fewer hands to help with farm work. At 17, Michael left for the neighboring town, where he could take a technical course. He found a modest job at a tractor repair shop, earning just enough to get by. Initially, he returned to the farm on weekends, but as life got busier, the visits became less frequent. Still, he tried to visit whenever he could, sharing stories of everything he was learning. For James and Emily, it was a mixture of pride and longing. The house felt emptier without Michael running through the rooms or chatting about his creative tinkering. Many nights, Emily sat in her rocking chair, thinking about how quickly time passed. James immersed himself in his work, now that he had more responsibilities. One day, Michael showed up unexpectedly with news that moved James and Emily to tears. He announced that he had been accepted into a mechanical engineering program in a larger city, thanks to a scholarship he'd earned with his strong technical performance. It meant moving away permanently, but it offered him a bright future. James hugged his son, tears of joy in his eyes. Emily wept too, remembering all the hardships they had endured to raise this child rescued from the brush. Now he was about to spread his wings. A few days later, Michael left, promising he would return whenever he could. In the years that followed, Millstone Farm changed significantly. Michael continued his studies, graduated, and found a good job with an agricultural machinery company, helping develop new technology for farms. Though life kept him busy, he never forgot the place he'd grown up. Whenever he had a chance, He visited James and Emily, who continued to care for the land with unwavering dedication. The small cross under the apple tree remained overgrown with foliage. Whenever Michael came home, he would visit that spot, place a flower there, or simply stand in silence for a moment to honor the memory of the unknown sibling who hadn't been so fortunate. The plaque bearing Daisy's name still stood, though worn by time and rain. One autumn evening, now about 25 years old, Michael sat at the kitchen table talking with Emily. James had gone to check the barn. It was cold outside, but the warmth from the wood-burning stove made the kitchen cozy. They talked about life, achievements, and old memories. Emily, her hair now streaked with silver, still wore her gentle smile. She looked at her son and said, "Sometimes I feel that all the suffering I went through losing my babies was balanced out the day Daisy led us to you. You brought light to this house, Michael." He held her hand, feeling a deep affection. He thanked her for everything she and James had done, for never treating him differently, and for giving him a home and a family. He mentioned that in his childhood dreams, he often saw a white cow leading him through green fields as though guiding him. Emily smiled. She was certain Daisy had indeed been an angel in their lives. When James returned from the barn, he joined his son at the table, and they talked about improvements to the farm, how technology could boost production. Michael mentioned installing solar panels on the roof to cut energy costs. His father listened proudly, realizing just how much Michael had grown into a resourceful man. Later, they all went to bed, and the calm of night fell over Millstone Farm. The wind rustled the trees in the yard, leaves swaying. If anyone listened closely, they might have heard a soft whisper on the breeze, almost like the distant cry of a baby and the gentle moo of a cow. Two presences that once broke the farm's silence and forever changed a family's life. Over the years, Michael started a family of his own. He visited often, bringing his wife and later his children to experience farm life and meet the loving grandparents who had taken him in. Each visit rang with laughter from children running across fields, gathering eggs from the chicken coop, and learning that while country life could be tough, it was also full of beauty. James and Emily aged, but remained side by side until the end. Everywhere on the property were memories of happier and sadder moments, of overcome challenges and quiet miracles. The cross beneath the apple tree continued to bear witness to passing seasons, covered in moss yet still upright. Time didn't erase the pain of finding that second baby lifeless, but the love for the one who survived turned the farm into a place of light. To those who knew their story, it was proof that even out of deep darkness can come new hope. Sometimes that hope arrives silently, wrapped in a newborn's faint cries. Other times it appears in a cow's insistent moo. Either way, it's a reminder that the earth accepts all that comes to it, both beginnings and endings, and in a loving heart, there is always room for rebirth. The farm, with its fields, animals, and routines, was the stage for one of the most profound stories James and Emily ever experienced. Finding an abandoned baby, losing another, then offering care, hope, and unconditional love, formed the foundation of a journey that transformed not only their lives, but Michael's as well, the boy who came in such an unexpected way. Time passed and brought new phases and challenges, but the essence remained. The same home that once felt lonely and sad now housed warm memories, shaped by a destiny that bound that family together. Even when death intruded, taking the second baby and, years later, loyal Daisy, life continued to blossom, yielding fruits of gratitude and compassion. This story shows that love can arise under the most improbable circumstances. James, who never believed in signs or hunches, learned to trust Daisy's instincts when she led him to a barely alive baby. Emily, who had suffered the pain of multiple losses, found in Michael the healing of past wounds. And Michael, who arrived like a seed scattered by chance on the soil, grew strong and resolute, carrying forward the legacy of love and kindness he received. On nights with a full moon, when the wind sweeps across the hills of Millstone Farm, there's a different vibration in the air. Perhaps it's the echo of memories, muffled cries and silent prayers. Perhaps it's the earth itself whispering, holding stories of pain and hope in its depths. But above all, it's the echo of two lives that crossed paths in an unforeseen way, reminding us that compassion and love can change destinies and illuminate even the darkest corners.